right, hello everyone.
Welcome. Welcome to the Zoom room.
Yes,
Hi,
thank
Kim.
you for joining us tonight. My name is Sarah Skowinski and I am the Adult Services Director at Portland Public Library. Tonight's event is part of our sustainability series, which we are thrilled to host along with our partners at the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative. In fact, tonight marks the start of our 5th season collaborating on the sustainability series. And now I would like to turn it over to Jessica Burton, Executive Director of the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative, to introduce our program this evening on Portland Trails and the creation of the Eastern Prom Trail with Nathan Smith. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining. I'm super excited that this is our 5th year of this program. We've had such amazing speakers. And it's been really fun, and we will continue into the future. And we were not deterred. Here we are in Zoom. We did a quick pivot and started showing everybody our great speakers on Zoom, and we've had great turnout. So the Southern Maine Conservation Collaborative is a network of land and water conservation organizations, and we're committed to supporting those organizations in their work to make the initiatives and the activities around collaboration and impact greater through those relationships. One of our members is Portland Trails, and we're really excited to host and amplify their voice and their story tonight with our series. And I am particularly excited because I worked for Portland Trails at the time that Nathan will be talking about. And it's really neat to have this sort of circle around in my life. So I'm going to tell you about our speaker, Nathan Smith, who is a co-founder of Portland Trails, along with Dick Spencer and Tom Jewell, and he was the first president of Portland Trails. He's been an attorney with Bernstein Shore since 1982, and where he is now of counsel. He was a community leader in Portland for over 3 decades and served on the Portland City Council from 1998 to 2004, and as mayor from 2003 to 2004. For his work as point man on the Eastern Prom Trail, he received the National Park Service's first Conservation Hero Award, presented in the state of Maine. Nathan and his wife Eleanor now live in Kalikura. He'll do a better job with that. On the Big Island of Hawaii. So really wonderful that Nathan's able to join us tonight to tell this story, and we're so glad to have the rest of you here. So take it away, Nathan.
Thank you, Jess, and it's been nice to reconnect with you. And I had originally looked forward to being in Portland to see people, but of course this year has turned out a little differently than any of us expected. One of the things I thought I'd do is talk a little bit about the land that I'm talking about, which is where the Eastern Prom Trail is, on the assumption that not everybody has walked on that trail and knows about it. And so I thought I'd give a little bit of description about that just to get started. I also, by way of caveat, I'm going to say some things about the beginning of Portland Trails, just share a few stories. But also by way of caveat that each of the founders, and for that matter, all the other people who really were there early on, I noticed Peter Monroe is on this, who followed me as president, all had different roles to play. And that's certainly true of me. And I'll elaborate on that a little bit. You know, I had a certain niche that I was in, and that was where my energy went. And one maybe more obvious example of that is the story I'm going to tell you right now. But let's start with the land. This essentially is about 30 acres of land owned by Canadian National Railroad, which is the former location of the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad. And if we go maybe to the next slide, there's some pictures that were color pictures done by C. Michael Lewis. We asked him to do this. Eliza Nolan, whom I'll talk about later, suggested, let's go one more there, okay, to the picture, yeah. that we should get some pictures done. So we met with Michael Lewis, the Portland artist. Many of you are no doubt familiar with him. And we had him do up some pictures. And this first picture you look at that shows the Portland Shoreway also shows the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Administrative Building, which is that sort of building in the center there at the base of 1 India Street. People who know Portland know that building. If you go up close to that building, you'll see a plaque on the building, and it says milepost 0.0 on the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Sea Railway. So the railroad began right at that building and goes along where you see a road, which now actually does exist more or less along the waterfront. Let's go to the next. If you look at this was probably the best picture Michael did in terms of anticipating what things might look like. It's still not exact, but it's close enough. Remember, this predates all the planning and designing and building. But what's noteworthy in this picture, other than the rough approximation to what exists, is you'll notice the granite wall on the right side there. And the point to keep in mind here is that when this railroad got built, this was all tidal lands, flats. And so they had to put in a granite wall and then fill behind it because there were railroad tracks that wrapped around the base of the Eastern Prom. But the long and the short of it is, this is the east end of the Portland Peninsula, and this is the corridor that wraps around the peninsula. Next, we go to the next picture. Here, the artistic license gets a little off over the top, but what matters is that as you wrap around the peninsula, in the distance, of course, is Tukey's Bridge, which is 295, and then the B&M factory in the middle there with the smokestack. But the trestle bridge kind of exists, and the swivel in the middle of it. Okay, that's the swivel and trestle bridge. And the right-of-way we're talking about does not go to the left of that entrance to the bridge. That's Portland Water District property, and that's not the topography. And I'll explain why that matters later. But the right-of-way went to mile 1.75, which is about 50 yards upland on the other side of that bridge in East Deering. So that's the land we're talking about. And in that land, I'll elaborate a little bit as we go along. Okay, there's some different parcels, and that becomes important when we talk about piecing this whole puzzle together and getting everybody who was going to be involved in it. But anyway, the question might be, let's go to the next slide. How did the corridor end up in public ownership? And the short answer is that the stars lined up. And I'm going to talk now about the but-for events that made it possible for all of us to walk along this pathway at the water's edge today in a 388-year-old city. Keep in mind that most land on the Portland Peninsula at the water's edge was gobbled up long ago for private use. Witness the Portland waterfront. Next, the first seminal but-for event, but for the creation of the world and stuff like that. The first seminal but-for event is the creation of the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad. It was John Poor's vision, and the idea he had was that this railroad would make Portland a warm water port for the city of Montreal. You couldn't get to Montreal by sea back in 1847. And so he said, well, look, you can get in the winter, most of the time, you can get to the port of Portland. So let's get a train, set it up, and transport vital things to Montreal. And so they proceeded to build the railroad. I've already told you about milepost 0.0. And this railroad was an economic driver for the city of Portland, one of them, for many, really well over 100 years after that. What happened was that the coal would come up the coast from further south and would pull into piers, and you can still see the remnants of the piers on the waterfront. You'll see pilings sticking up as you walk along the water there. Those pilings are the old coal piers, and they would unload the coal onto railroad cars and ship the coal to Montreal. And when they got to Montreal, they would then turn around and fill the cars with wheat from the Canadian plains and bring that back down to Portland. And for those who are old enough, they may remember there was an old wheat building. I forget the term for it, but it's a big brick building which held wheat. It was over 100 feet high, and that was where they stored the wheat. And then eventually, of course, it would be sold and shipped wherever. The final thing about the railroad, which is worth mentioning, is the railroad for a while also transported people from Portland to Canada. And for a brief while, House Island in the middle of Casco Bay, just off the waterfront there, served as a mini Ellis Island. And so there are families to this day in Canada whose first landing in North America was not Ellis Island, or it was in fact House Island. And then they got on the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad and went to Montreal and never looked back. The next important point about this is that the Canadians eventually figured out, that they needed more than just a thin railroad link in the winter. So they built the St. Lawrence Seaway project, which essentially opened up the deep draft waterway to the Great Lakes. They put in locks and canals and dredge and everything else. And now you can get, I think, to Duluth, Minnesota by boat, by ship. But when they did that, that happened in the late 50s. When they did that, the Atlantic and St. Lawrence Railroad ceased to have a reason to exist. So it went into decline, and eventually the line was abandoned, which is a technical term for it's no longer a functioning operative railroad. And this talks about the flow and ebb of economic development. This is the next but-for circumstance. In the early 1980s, when I got to Portland, things were heating up. Savings and loans, I'm reluctant to get into too much about this, but I'll give you the brief version. You'll recall, for those who are old enough, that there was inflation and interest rates were up in double digits to borrow money for a house or to borrow money or anything else, or what banks would pay if you deposited money. Savings and loans are going out of business. So the federal government, because they were limited in what they could pay for interest. So the federal government said, well, we need to fix that. So they said, you can pay whatever you can afford to pay in interest on deposits, and which was fine. So they could pay more interest, but then they had to go earn it. So then when they got the money, they had to then turn around and loan it. And they loaned it out recklessly to developers. I can't tell you how many projects I worked on where buildings got built with no tenants. And so it was only a matter of time before the whole bubble burst, because buildings with no tenants don't pay rent, they don't pay their mortgages, and they default, and you have foreclosures. What happened? The whole economy, the boom economy, went down the tubes. Now, this was important for a couple of reasons. One was that at the time, I learned later, the land we're talking about was valued at $4.8 million. I don't think it was on the market, but people were sniffing around it because they wanted to develop this magnificent piece of water frontage. And I'll talk more about that later. The other thing that happened was that the boom along the waterfront meant there was some very aggressive permitting going on the waterfront at Long Wharf, where DeMillo's is located. There was a massive building that got permitted. My firm was involved in that. It's a building that I'm relieved never got built, because it would have totally dwarfed the waterfront. But the moratorium came through and would not, ironically, have stopped that building, but it stopped another building on Fisherman's Wharf next door and any development on the waterfront. And so that was a public referendum that happened, and it stopped in its tracks development on the waterfront. These two events, waterfront moratorium and recession, are essential pieces of the puzzle that eventually came together. The next thing that happened, again, these are stars lining up, was, and let me back up for a minute to give a little history. The Federal Highway Act was passed in 1956 under President Eisenhower. It contemplated 41,000 miles of interstate highways, and it essentially dominated what happened with transportation. It was the reign of the automobile and the truck for the next 40 plus years. But by the time you get into the 1980s, people are beginning to react to that. And the Main Sensible Transportation Act was an act, a referendum that rejected adding another lane to the main turnpike. Another variant on new thinking about transportation was to start looking at pedestrian and bicycle transportation. Not unheard of, but not focused on, certainly not as a matter of federal policy, and not so, not as much as it should have been, even at the local level. But the city of Portland at the time had the foresight, I think in particular of Joe Gray, the Director of Planning and Urban Development, Bob McGanley, the city manager, Alex Yeagerman, the city planner, certainly the city council, and Rick Nolan, who was active with Portland Trails for years, helping implement it. The Shoreway Access Plan gave the outline of what a bunch of trails in the city might look like. And that, of course, is really the seed for Portland Trails. Finally, there's a thing called the intermodal, the Portland planning, the transportation planning under Mayor Allen was, ironically, it's a plan that people still refer to when they talk about doing stuff in the city. I'll leave it at that. Maybe people should go dig it out. But the Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act has an important role to play here, and it's one of those essential stars that lined up. And what it was is the federal response to the desire to add into transportation new ways of thinking and not just focus on sand, gravel, and interstate highways. So keep that in mind as we go along. Okay. The Portland Shoreway Access Plan generated interest among people who were paying attention. I was not one of them at that time. Normally I pay close attention to what happens in Portland, but I wasn't as close to this as I might have been. But what happened was there was a group called the Shoreway Access Coalition. It had sort of morphed out of the Forest City Land Trust, which was, to use Tom Jewell's term, a quiet land trust in the city. And they had been watching the Shoreway Access Plan evolve, and the plan had contemplated being implemented in 50 years. And that brings us to Dick Spencer. Dick said, well, why don't we knock the 0 off the 50 and do it in 5 years? That was a fairly grand thought, but it was typical of Dick. What happened was, in the very beginning, Eleanor and I had moved to Capissick Street, and we could look over at the cut over the Fore River where that bridge eventually got built to connect Stroudwater Crossing with the Fore River Sanctuary. And I called Dick Spencer up and said, hey, Dick, I like the idea of getting some trails built. How can I help? And he said, well, let me think about it. And so we eventually met. Tom Jewell was part of that, and we decided to found Portland Trails. I'm going to share in a minute a couple thoughts about the different roles and personalities of the three of us. But I think that when we did that, we were talking about the name, and we were also meeting with Charles Tracy, who was with the National Park Service. Dick had managed to engineer a grant from the National Park Service to have Charles help us. And coincidentally, we're still using the logo today from that original work that Charles did back in 1990, I guess, was probably when that happened. But we talked about names, and I think Tom Jewell suggested Portland Trailblazers. And I said, being a basketball fan, I said, that won't work. Okay, that's the name of the professional basketball team and the other Portland. Okay, we need to come up with a different name. So I think either Dick or I came up with Portland Trails. Doesn't matter really, but the bottom line is we settled on that name. I thought I'd say something briefly about the different roles of the founders. And I'll try to be brief because I won't do justice to anybody, but I'm going to start with Tom Jewell, because Tom is one of those people, in many ways, when I think of Tom and Portland Trails, I think about the Celtic tree spirits. are talked about in Celtic legend. And I think about Tom as someone who his entire life has probably been to every square foot of unbuilt on space in the city of Portland. He's haunted these spaces and occupied them, and is always the person who can see another link or has been there or appreciates the value of it as a wild or an open space. And so Tom has been just persistently there, always coming up with new ideas. But that was his, that was sort of his special gift, you might say, to Portland Trails. Celtic tree spirit is where I put Tom. Dick is interesting because Dick would be the first person to tell you that he says, my attention span for new ventures is about 6 years. And I know Dick and have known him long enough now to know that that's generally true, but he also wasn't entirely telling the truth, because I'm familiar with the work he's done in the Ringsley Lakes, which can only be described as legendary to preserve land and open space and so on, forests. And that's gone on for 35 or 40 years. But Dick was the one with sort of the grand vision. He wanted to knock the 0 off the 50. He wanted to create an organization that would grow in popularity to get the kind of membership and organizational visibility that Portland Landmarks had gotten by that time in the late 80s. He also had one project that he really wanted to personally see through, which was getting the bridge built over the Fore River. And he eventually did that, and that was his primary focus. Very quickly, because I'll never get to the real story here, Dick and I are driving down. As for myself, my interest, and this is my bias, was not in building membership. It just wasn't my strength. My interest was in getting corridors, easements, rights of way, places to put trails. And that was my primary focus. I did a fair amount of that over the 90s, but I'm just talking for the moment about the Eastern Prom Trail. What happened was I became the first president by default. Dick and I are driving down Commercial Street, and we were figuring out who was going to be the first president. And our egos were such that it was going to be one or the other of us. And Dick said, well, I'm about to be president of Maine Audubon, so I don't think I should do it. And I said, well, look, I've got a year in here where there's a window before I become president of United Way. And so we figured out, all right, I'd plug into the slot and do it. And then we'd get someone else to do it. And if I recall correctly, I think Peter Monroe succeeded me. Thank you, Peter, for that. And we also solved for the most part, we solved the founder syndrome problem, which is the syndrome nonprofits have of where the founders hang around too long and you can't get rid of them. As for Tom, I think always has preferred to play a more low-key role. So even though Tom is still around, it's been low-key as opposed to dominating the conversation, which founders can sometimes do. I mentioned Dick's interest in the Fore River Sanctuary pedestrian bridge access, a prodigious feat and very complicated. Dick, very talented, was able to make that happen. The Eastern Prom Trail, I'm going to talk about. First of all, Canadian National decided that it wanted to divest its real estate in the United States. Why Canadian National? Because they became the owner of the railroad. It started out Atlantic St. Lawrence, went to Grand Trunk, then became Canadian National, and they owned it. And remember, they pretty much abandoned it and shut it down, but kept the land in the 60s, 70s. The interest in the railroad, however, the development interest in the corridor was largely gone because of the recession. Banks weren't loaning any money, nobody was developing anything, and we had a waterfront moratorium on development as well. So the players in all of that, let's go to the next slide, were really the city of Portland for economic development and part of the land, Portland Trails, now in existence, wanting to get trails built, the main narrow gauge railway, which would come to operate out of the Portland Company property, which is just a little further up the trail from that milepost 00 I talked about. And the Portland company also had a marina to the water side of the trail there. So they wanted land. And then the Maine Department of Transportation, who had a statutory mandate to rail bank land. Let's go on to the next slide quickly. The most important point here is that on the plan that the Park Service helped the Portland Trails develop, the Eastern Prom Trail, the importance of it and the centrality of it is prominent and obvious. What else happened though was we wanted to get control of the land, obviously, to get a trail built. And the question became, well, how are we going to do that? And I had, I was a commercial real estate lawyer, so I knew something about getting land and so on, but it was still a very complicated business, politically, legally, fiscally, it was very complicated. And so Charles Tracy, who was the guy from the National Park Service helping us, said we should approach the Trust for Public Land, which we did. And I called Eliza Cope. This is one of those fateful calls. I called Eliza Cope with the Trust for Public Land and said, why don't you come to Portland and we'll tell you a story about a great trail opportunity, which we did. And TPL, in the person of Eliza and those backing her, said, we're going to help. And TPL, the Trust for Public Land, we would have learned they had never done a project in Maine. They had done about 800 projects nationally. And what they did is they were a fairly sizable nonprofit that would help secure land destined to be in public ownership, but where the private sector could not wait around long enough for the public sector to get its act and its money together. That's how they came to be. And they've actually served a very valuable function in that role. And that was certainly how we hoped they would help us. So they were going to be, we hoped, and this is what I learned as I got to know the organization better. They were going to be the organization that would step in and, if all else failed, get authority to negotiate directly with Canadian National to get a contract on the land. Then they would help secure the funding, i.e. do the scouring for funding and handle the due diligence. And then at the very end, they would assign their contract, sometimes in pieces, which happened here, to the different end buyers. And as it turned out, the different end buyers are the ones I mentioned earlier, the Portland company, or at least their associates, and the city of Portland, and the Maine Department of Transportation. But the challenges are what's interesting about this story and the improbability of all of this. Let's go to the next slide for a minute, okay? The first question would be, given the importance of this piece of land, the centrality of it, the fact that it was highlighted in the Shoreway access plan, the sheer obvious significance of it as a potential walkway or something else, why would Portland Trails, a fledgling nonprofit that had, I think, maybe 12 members, all of whom were members of the board, brand new, no resources, and TPL, a California land trust, lead this effort? Okay, a land trust nobody, by the way, had ever heard of in Maine, or practically nobody. Why shouldn't the city of Portland take the lead, or the Maine Department of Transportation? I'll elaborate on that in a minute, okay, as to why they didn't. But just think about that as a question, the improbability of this. The other question is, who should own the corridor? And, it was an old rail corridor. There were potential for hazardous waste in the corridor. And even if that wasn't a problem, the other issue was the swivel and trestle bridge. If that ever had to be removed as a hazard to navigation, it could cost millions. Another risk, okay, on the other side of the equation was that the rail use, okay, remember it's a former railroad corridor, and so there's the opportunity to put rails back in that corridor and bring trains right down to the center of the waterfront, which had once happened. And the question is, would that crowd out the trail use completely? That was a worry. And one of the reasons you might say why we wanted to drive this bus, not just be passengers on the bus. Another risk that is worth thinking about, if remember in the earlier picture there, you saw Tukey's Bridge in the distance, but if you imagine if this had been 1970, the highway planners would have said, well, of course, what we're going to do is we're going to bring an off-ramp off Tukey's Bridge, and we're going to get you right to downtown Portland. And the perfect way to do it is to come over the water by the Water District property, pop onto the land on the old conveniently located railroad corridor, and bring a 2-lane or 4-lane road right down to the head of Commercial Street. In 1970, that might have happened. 1990, not so much. Let's go to the next slide here. So the risk was then, if others took the lead, who would safeguard the trail interests? Okay, that was one question and a big concern. The second question was, we didn't have a clue what this corridor was worth. When we started sniffing around, we heard the number 4.8 million, which sounded intimidating. Let me give you a sense of Portland Trail's finances at the time, okay? I digress. The first trail project we did, building project, was at Capissic Pond Park. And this is before we hired Alix Hopkins. We had a part-time director, Donna Kane, and I went out there and I said, Donna, we need to get some gravel, okay? And she said, okay, I'll go get the gravel. So she goes out and she calls me and says, well, it's going to cost $500. And I said, okay. And I called Dick and we each agreed to kick in $250. And so we had this great trail building day, spread the gravel, had a trail built and everything. And about a week and a half later, I get a call from Donna. Donna says, hey, can you get me that money? I used my rent check to pay for that gravel and I need to pay my rent before I get evicted. Okay. That was the status of Portland Trail's finances at the time. So we didn't have any money, but we didn't know what the corridor was going to cost anyway. But we had that chilling number of 4.8 million, which was sitting out there. However, the silver lining was the recession and the waterfront moratorium had depressed values appreciably. The final challenge was the Trust for Public Lands business model. And I'm not sure I can do justice to this now without not telling you more about what comes later. I'll leave it at this, okay? The way I'll try to do it succinctly. The way they work is they would come in and they would go, in this case, they went to Canadian National and strike a deal to buy the land. They'd get an option to buy the land. And they wouldn't tell anybody what the price was, but it would be below fair market value, which was important for public entities because appraisals would come in and they would not, one, they would not, and two, they could not pay more than fair market value, usually, depending on the funding source. But TPL would never tell people what the price was. They would just say, we're going to tell you what the takeout price is for us. And what would happen is they would get the money to buy the land and they would get their expenses back and they would get some kind of premium, which they would then use to move on to the next project. And that was a big pill for people to swallow locally. And I can't tell you how much time I spent trying to talk people involved, ranging from city councilors to legislators and so on, why you didn't need to worry about that. They weren't going to rip people off. But keep in mind, because the typical model was a broker. A broker says, well, I'm going to charge you 6% if I sell your house, and you know what the number is, and everybody kind of gets that. But the difference is the broker wasn't taking the contractual risk of signing the contract, maybe coming up with a deposit, maybe doing all the due diligence, the survey work, the environmental assessments, and everything else, and helping you go find the money. So TPL was playing a very different role, but that was a big pill to swallow to an organization unknown in Maine. I can't tell you how much time I spent dealing with that personally just to kind of break the ice with them. Which gets to another point, is what I've called legitimation. This is maybe one of the biggest challenges. When I mentioned before, why Portland Trails? Why should anybody pay attention to us? Perhaps even TPL, but especially Portland Trails, really. In other words, why trust us to do this, or why have us do it? Why shouldn't the city do it? And what we had to do as an organization was establish legitimacy. And to some degree, we had some of that because Dick and I both had pretty high profile presence in the city. I'll start with Dick. Okay, conveniently, okay, Dick's law partner was Tom Allen, who was mayor. That didn't hurt. And his other law partner, Harry Pringle's wife, would become mayor during the period I'm talking about, Anne Pringle. And so there was a fairly strong connection there with the city of Portland on Dick's side. And Dick, of course, was about to become president of Maine Audubon, and you know, a very well-respected, high visibility lawyer in the city. That didn't hurt. I had been doing a lot of stuff, primarily with United Way on homelessness and housing issues, but then also led an effort to reject a tax cap, which was threatened in the city of Portland that would have been devastating. Frankly, it would have radically changed the whole future of the city. And I ended up getting dragged into that and became the leader of the effort to reject it, and succeeded. And so the city knew me pretty well because me and the other people who worked on that had saved their asses, basically, okay, in terms of the threat that that cap might have brought. I'll leave it at that. But anyway, the long and the short of it was we had some fairly high profile presence in the city. The National Park Service partnership was immensely important, and that was the grant we got from the Rivers and Trails Conservation Assistance Program. We didn't get it, Dick got it. And that was one of his biggest contributions to Portland Trails, getting that grant. And all of our early logo stuff and a lot of the planning coming in, the big vision map and things like that were all done with National Park Service help, and they were immensely important. The Shoreway Access Plan called for a public-private partnership. Sometimes that's lip service, and it's nice to say it. It's another thing for it to happen. In this case, it happened in spades. And I think the success of Portland Trails and the trail system we now have in the city and the size of Portland Trails speaks for itself in terms of a uniquely successful public-private partnership. But at least the city had committed to that. So here we were, you know, ready to dance. The other thing we had was we had high visibility in the press. And, you know, there are hundreds of clippings where the press, George Naval, the editorial page editor, and others following him were wildly enthusiastic about the trail system and very, very supportive. And even the alternative press, for the most part, was very supportive, although you can ask me about one or two low moments with them if you want. TPL's involvement, once people figured out what TPL was, it was pretty significant to have an organization with that kind of track record and size be involved. And then most importantly on legitimation was the opportunity. In other words, the Eastern Prom Trail was a breathtaking opportunity, but everybody was going, well, who's going to make this happen? How's it going to happen? You know, what's going to happen? And in the end, we, and the we for the moment, I'll suggest, it's all these players and organizations, but it was also came down to two people at some critical transitional moments, and that was Eliza and I. The next slide gives you some idea about the press and legitimation. This is pretty common on the editorial page, okay? And you'll see terms like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, the jewel in the crown, those kinds of things. Common accolades, but I think the trail experience speaks for itself. So then back to the point is why partner with Portland Trails and TPL? We met with Bob Ganley and Joe Gray, and Bob was on board with the idea. Joe, he essentially said to Joe, I want you to shepherd this, and that was appropriate. Joe brought, it was a way of the city keeping track of what was happening, but also Joe had been you know, very competent and had experience working with federal funding sources and everything else. So he was the perfect go-between. I mentioned the Portland Trails connections to the city council. What we also did was we said to the city, which had had a verbal offer from Canadian National a decade earlier for the corridor, And MDOT, who had also had a verbal offer, we said, if you think you can get this corridor, go do it. You know, take 4 or 5 months, see if you can get a deal with Canadian National. And so we waited 4 to 5 months. We were working on other things at the time, but we waited 4 to 5 months and nothing happened. Nothing, they got no real opening with Canadian National, and there was no substantive conversations about the acquisition of the land. That became really important because being there, that whole point about being there became really important. If it was going to happen, we were going to have to pretty much make it happen, or at least get it to a certain point and then see what happens. Hunt for the money. One of the things TPL does, and Eliza was, this was the discipline that Eliza brought to this undertaking, was we went looking for money anywhere it might be found. And there was talk of the Land for Maine's Future Board, which legendary Portland Trails volunteer Roger Burley was later involved with and helped us on other projects. It was really too early, and the Land for Maine's Future Board just didn't materialize as a potential source on this project. So we thought about it, but it wasn't there yet. The next thing was the Greater Portland Public Development Commission. I knew through my friend George Crockett, who'd been commissioner there for years, that they had a stash of about $500,000 that was carryover money from the liquidation of federal properties that had been liquidated after World War II. And the money was supposed to be spent for the region in some way. And so we went and talked to Mert Henry at Jensen Baird about that. And Mert graciously said, well, maybe that money should be used for that. It wouldn't have been his call, of course. It would have been the commission's call. But in the meantime, we decided to also, that was sort of a plan B, to use that to help if we could find a way to get at that money, which was a big, big question. But there it was. And so then there was this other thing lingering in the background called iced tea. But before I talk about iced tea, or I'll talk about when it first came up, George Flaherty, the city public works director, called a meeting, and he had a couple of guys from MDOT who knew about some federal funding sources. Some other folks, a representative from Senator Mitchell's office, and Eliza and I went, and a bunch of other people. And what was interesting about the meeting was, the meeting we had, and maybe there was another follow-up meeting, it was about a bunch of old kind of white guys sitting around talking about funding sources, most of which didn't seem to be leading anywhere. And I remember Eliza at one point said, you know, remember Eliza's this newbie from Boston representing a California land trust. You know, there's this federal reauthorization of the Highway Act, the 1991 reauthorization, which has created this wonderful category that might be perfect for this, called iced tea. And she mentioned it, and it, you know, everybody just kind of ignored her and moved on. Park that thought, okay. And then there was the possibility of a City of Portland appropriation. And when I got on the council, I learned more about that process and orders of magnitude. But that, in the end, would be part of the piece that made it happen. Okay, using city tax dollars because of the importance to the city. But at the moment, we had nothing, okay? Early on in the game, we had nothing. But what did happen was Eliza was determined not to let this iced tea opportunity drop. The important thing to keep in mind, though, is that nobody knew, and let's go to the next slide, okay, iced tea 1. And ICE-T stands for Intermodal Surface Transportation Efficiency Act. And that was 1991, the reauthorization of the federal highway bill. And the idea was we wanted to tap into federal dollars. And the person who knew about that was our call him, he was both a mentor and a watchdog and one of the visionaries as well, Joe Gray. And so we met with Joe to talk about how to tap into federal highway dollars. And we learned you had to go to the local metropolitan planning organization and get into the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan. Again, the thing to keep in mind is the bottom thing on this bullet here. But other than the federal regulations, which were sparse on this. There were no rules, guidelines, policies, procedures, or precedents for this entirely new category of transportation funding. Okay, now, I had quoted Howard Reike in the beginning, timing is everything, but I didn't attribute the quote to Howard. Another story for another day, I'll tell you about Howard and Portland Trails. But timing is everything. I want to talk about the timing here because this is where the stars lined up. The PACS meeting, that was the local metropolitan planning organization. It's almost as good an acronym as ICE-T. It's the Portland Area Comprehensive Transportation Study Group. And Eliza sends them a letter on April 27th asking for PACS funding. And she asked me to cover the meeting on April 29th. And we were going to meet at 3:45 in the afternoon. This is where timing is interesting. So at 3:30, I'm getting ready to leave my office at 100 Middle Street down by the police station and drive over, 5 minutes over to the Council of Governments for a 3:45 presentation. And Eliza calls me and says, check your fax machine. And over the fax machine comes a memo from the Federal Department of Transportation. What happened was that on April 24th, the Federal Department of Transportation had issued a memo, essentially 5 days earlier. And the memo had not even gone public or that public. It was available, but it was not that public, that laid out perfectly what so-called enhancement funding could be spent on, which if we had sat down and said, let's write something that fits the Eastern Prom Trail, okay, in terms of the public involvement, in terms of the use of the funds and everything else, we would have written that memo. We wouldn't have changed much in that memo, and we wouldn't want to be too obvious, but that's what we would have written. So I photocopy the memo, underline a few things, and have now become the world's leading expert on ICE-T funding in the 5 minutes before the meeting. I go over to PACS, and on the way in, I run into Finn Sprague, who is the main narrow gauge Portland company guy. We have a 3-minute conversation, the gist of which is we'll find a way to make the trail and the narrow gauge railroad coexist. Finn goes off, and I go into the meeting and ask them, first of all, I go into the meeting, and Joe Gray talks about it later. He always got a kick out of the fact that none of the federal employees had seen the memo. And I'm the world's leading expert on this. I've never done anything this simple. The world's leading expert on ICE-T funding because I've got this memo, which I might as well have written because it fit the Eastern Prom Trail so perfectly. Needless to say, they approved an allocation of $1.6 million. Why $1.6 million? Once again, we didn't have a clue what the land was worth, but the city had appraised it at $1.6 million, so we said, let's use that number. 5 minutes later, I leave the meeting and we have a placeholder in the Transportation Improvement Plan for $1.6 million. Timing is everything. A month or so later, and by the way, getting into the Transportation Improvement Plan is important, but you still need the Maine Department of Transportation on board because they're the conduit for federal dollars. So Joe Gray and I and Eliza went to Augusta to meet with Dana Connors, the Commissioner of Transportation, on a furlough day, June, another month and a half after this meeting or so, 2 months after the meeting, and made a presentation to him. Dana Connors was a great Commissioner of Transportation, not in the least part because he supported this wholeheartedly, but also because, he had been a city manager, a town manager in Maine, and eventually became head of the chamber for many years in Maine, but just was a good visionary thinker. And once he saw Michael Lewis's drawing, he heard about the vision, we talked about ICE-T. His response was, by the way, he said, are you in the TIP, the Transportation Improvement Plan? And we, thanks to Joe and Eliza, could say, yep, we are. And he said, fine, let me know what I can do to help. I'll support you. And MDOT did. That was the picture we showed Dana. He liked it. And remember, MDOT's mandate is to rail bank, preserve that rail corridor. But now it had another potential mandate, or at least potential use for funds, which were so-called enhancement funding, which is funds to create transportation enhancements, i.e. the Eastern Prom Trail. A fateful meeting was when Eliza and I one day were exiting Bernstein Sure, and we ran into Ed Kane, a former law partner and good friend, and we told Ed a little bit about the project, and he said, well, you have to talk to George Campbell. And George is one of the heroes in getting the trail funded, but especially in later on as a city councilor in helping to get it built and designed. But George became an invaluable help because he understood that it's good to get the Commissioner of Transportation on your side, but unless you've got some serious political horsepower, it's not that easy to keep them on your side when you have to deal with the entire transportation bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy had no clue about enhancement funding or had ever thought about it. They were sand and gravel and highways and off-ramps. And so that was the challenge of the next several months. I mentioned Joe Brannigan quickly, but importantly, Joe, many people know, worked for Shalom House, a local nonprofit social service agency, but was also in the legislature for decades. And Eliza and I met with Joe to talk about it. We were covering political bases in Portland, and Joe, not long after that, became the Senate co-chair of the Joint Standing Committee on Transportation from the legislature. In essence, if other than the governor, Dana Connor's boss, okay, and boss is the wrong term, but the most important person for Dana Connor to be in touch with. And Joe was very supportive of the trail and played a vital role in keeping MDOT focused, okay. The next point is the Portland Company. All I will say is that it's another story for another hour to explain the complexity of the relationship between the Portland Company, the trail acquisition, the Portland Yacht Marina, which was on the water side of the trail. And I don't think I can do that justice in 2 minutes. I will say it was one of the most challenging negotiations we had, but the important point from a trail perspective was that we wanted the Portland Company's presence to be very carefully defined. Okay, imagine a big piece of land upland of the trail, then you had the rail and trail corridor, then you had a marina on the water side of the trail. And the long and the short of it was we cut a deal with them. MDOT was upset that they didn't cut the deal, but frankly, we didn't completely trust MDOT. Okay, we weren't sure the breadth of the rights that they would get in the trail corridor. So we wanted to control and limit by definition of easements and rights and so on, what they could do and what they would get, which we did eventually, but that was no easy task. I'll leave it at that. We'll go through all those slides and then talk about the numbers. I don't know if I need to talk too much about the numbers other than to say the following, okay? The Portland Company got their access to the water and they got a strip of land along the water so they could continue to operate their marina, which is there to this day. And for them, it was a deal of a lifetime. I'll leave it at that. But they still paid a multiple of what the public entities paid for the land square footage. But it was important in the city's view, and we weren't going to get in the way of that property have access to the water and the marina thrive. So that's how that played out. The city ended up with 5 acres of land that I'll talk about in a minute. It ended up costing them, when everything played out and all the appraisals came in, it ended up costing them $54,000 an acre. So I'm going to go now to postscript and finish up, okay? All right, postscript part 1. The closing was on August 30th, 1993. This is what I'll call phase 1 of the trail, and that was getting the Canadian National land. And the land went, 5 acres went to the city down near the milepost 00, which was, other than where the trail went through and where the rail line went through, was for development. And the city got that for $54,000 an acre. 15, 20 years later, that land was worth $1 million an acre, and today There's over $100 million worth of real estate built buildings on that land, tax-paying built buildings on that land. So that was a good deal for the city. The phase two is what I'll call it, which is another story for another day, was the two things, well, maybe one in particular, was getting the other easements it took to get under Tukey's Bridge and negotiating the easement with MDOT. When we closed on the land, MDOT got the whole corridor except for the 5 acres that went to the city and the sliver and crossings that went to the Portland company. And the whole corridor went to MDOT, and there was a promise and the funding source which said we would get a trail for the city / Portland Trails and also park use. It took 21 months to negotiate that. And that I worked on that together with Donna Katsafikas at the City Corporation Council. And by then I think we were working with Tony Camerly, counsel for MDOT, but also Saran Pine, their outside counsel. But it took 21 months to do that. Okay, that was no easy job. And then the next part of that phase two was getting rights to cross the Portland Water District property to get to Back Cove. And the way you know where the Portland Water District property is, when you get to that point where the rail line turns over the Swivel and Trestle Bridge, in real life, there's a big hill right there. And you know it if you've climbed up it on the trail. And that's another 700 yards to get to Tukey's Bridge, and then under the bridge to the trail around Back Cove. So we had to cut a deal with the Portland Water District to do that. And they were a little nervous about that. And I will go on slightly more and tell you one story about that. The final piece, by the way, of the 3 phases was getting the trail designed, planned, designed, built, and funded. Okay, and that was part 3. I hung around for all 3 parts just because I was like a parent with a 2-year-old child. I wasn't going to let it out of my sight. For TPL, this was their 1000th project nationally by the time it closed, and the first one in Maine. The trail acquisition was the first use of ICE-T funds in Maine and among the first nationally. Bernstein Sure hired Eliza Cope, who moved to Portland to work as a commercial real estate attorney and is still doing that today. I'll mention in passing that about the time this trail opened, she had just finished doing a conservation easement deal in the Maine North Woods that in one transaction overnight doubled the amount of land under conservation easement in the entire United States. Portland Trails, under the leadership of Elise Hopkins and a remarkably talented group of board presidents, directors, and volunteers, grew to a 1,000-member organization in the following 7 years. As I mentioned at the beginning, I had next to nothing to do with that. It was not my forte. My interest was in rights of way and quarters and easements and deals. Finally, Portland Trails and all of Portland would get the jewel of the crown, the Eastern Prom Trail. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for that really informative talk about such an important place that I know we all spend so much time on. My office now is on Commercial Street, not far from where my old office with Portland Trails was, down in the Grand Trunk building way back when. And I have walking meetings on the Eastern Prom Trail regularly. And it's just a jewel, as you say. We do have one question here from Andy Abrams, who starts by saying thank you for being here tonight, Nathan. And he wonders, recognizing that tonight is about the Eastern Prom, but also wondering if you could tell a little bit about a lesser known trail that you helped to develop and its significance to you. So we're sort of opening up to you and Portland Trails and the city and your connection to other people on the
yeah. Well, I don't know which one to pick. You know, none was I more completely involved in the Eastern Prom Trail, but certainly the Stradwater Trail was one that I had a a lot to do with, as well as the Presumpscot Trail and some linkages over to the Four River Sanctuary and also the Bayside Trail. I'm not sure which one to pick. I've got to think about that for a minute. Okay, one that meant a lot. Well, they all mean a lot, but I'll stick with, let's take the Stroudwater River Trail. That's kind of fun, if nothing else. You know, that's a trail that runs up the Stroudwater River. In many ways, it follows an old fisherman's path that goes up the river. And it crosses land that Peter Kennedy owned for many years. Peter Kennedy was a client of Bernstein Sure. And I used to always needle Peter about putting a trail in there before he put his subdivision in. And I said it would enhance the value of the property. And Eleanor and I actually got an option on a lot to build a house there, but carefully set back from where the trail would be. But one thing led to another, and that property sat idle through that whole recession. But eventually Peter did decide to donate a strip of land for the trail in there. And Laurie Persley worked on that. She was the president of Portland Trails later on. And I started on it, but the conflict was such it made sense for Laurie to do that. And she did that. But that was one of those pieces of land where when we did the map with Charles Tracy, we just put the line on a map on a piece of private property. And we didn't know if we would ever get control of that land. The other private property it crossed was Unum's property. And one day Rick Nolan at the city called me up and he said, Nathan, you know, Unum's in permitting HO3, which was this massive office building up on the Unum campus. And you know, he said it might be a nice time to think about that trail. So I called up, I think it was Lanny Carroll, counsel for Unum, and said, Lanny, it would be a nice time for us to think about this trail. So we cut a deal with Unum to run the trail up the Stroudwater River to the main turnpike. And then, of course, as people know, it goes on beyond that. And that trail is there today, but there are parts of that trail when you get away from the noise of the turnpike and the noise of Congress Street, when you could be in the North Woods of Maine or something like that. So that's one. I could talk about others, but that I'll pick that one. Okay. Thank you, Andy, for the question.
Thanks, Nathan. Yeah, we've got some more questions coming in. So thank you, everybody. From Stephen Roberts, a question: was there one or more hairbreadth moments where everything almost fell apart with the Eastern Prom Trail project?
Absolutely. I will say, as a survivor of more than a few big projects, nothing worth doing doesn't involve dying 1,000 deaths when you work on them. There are always sometimes points where you just nearly shipwreck. And one of them was, I mentioned quickly that we had cut a deal with the Portland company for a crossing to frankly simplify it, because there were just too many players in the mix, and we had to simplify it to get it through the funding and public processes. And we did that with an option agreement to the Portland company with some very carefully circumscribed things that they would get by way of access to the water and a thin strip of land along the water for the marina. And MDOT was not happy that we did that. They had wanted to do that. And I'll leave it at this. That was where the fact that we had laid a political groundwork at the recommendation of George Campbell became invaluable, because there was a risk that MDOT would just blow everybody off and take over the whole thing and just go to CN and say, we're going to pay for this whole thing and forget about everybody else. And other than the fact we would have made a pretty big stink about it in the press and cried foul and everything else, they might just have done it. So that was one of them, okay? That was a low moment. I'll mention one other. There was another moment when, and this was the overall, if people ask me what I did here, I said, well, part of it was herding cats. There was also a moment when we weren't sure whether TPL was going to stay in the deal. Earlier on in the process, the regional manager for TPL came up with regional counsel for TPL, and Eliza was already up there for a meeting, and we met with them, but I met with them first, and I was convinced they wanted to pull the plug on the whole thing and just say, we're not going to do this. But I spent a fair amount of time explaining to them how much groundwork we had done with public officials and others. And I think they decided at that point that TPL's reputational risk wasn't something that they wanted to deal with. Later on, they got very enthusiastic about the trail. One of their vice presidents actually showed up at 6 o'clock in the morning one time with his daughter, and I took him for a hike on the trail and railed him about their business model and the fact that they wouldn't reveal the purchase price. His daughter agreed with me, by the way, and held his feet to the fire too, but they didn't change their policy or procedures. So those are two examples. There are others, but they're the ones that stand out most in my mind, keeping everybody on board. Thanks for the question, Stefan.
Thanks, Nathan. So just to we had a question come in, and I can actually answer it. TPL stands for the Trust for Public Land, and that's a national land trust that when they started being involved with this project in the 90s were much smaller than they are now, and they were key to that. So TPL is Trust for Public Land. So another question we have from Pam Green, who says hi. She says, there's a lot of building down around the trail where it begins, but it's being built around the trail. It's really nice. It's a really nice looking area if you go to the marina. Are you pleased with what's happening down there?
Well, keep in mind, I'm nice to hear from you, Pam. I'm a year out of date now. We haven't been there since September of a year ago. We had planned to be there this September, but that wasn't to be. I think on balance, it's been okay. You know, after that, the opening of the trail, I started, even though I was on the council, I started to let go a little bit and stop being such a meddlesome person when it came to trail things. And I was okay with what happened to the trail between India Street and where it narrows up into the rail trail corridor, you know, up by the marina, the Portland Company property. I was okay with what was happening there, but I wasn't super excited about it. I thought the trail kind of got narrowed up a little bit in there, but I haven't seen it as it's sort of been. I know there's some reconfiguring going on where the trail was to go down by the water at the marina, which I think is exciting, you know, to get closer to the water. So I think that's good. Ultimately, as long as there's a way to get through the property and the trail is wide enough to be comfortably used by people, I'm happy. So I guess that's your answer, Pam. Yep.
That's great. I actually was on the new part of the trail just yesterday, and it's really cool to be so close to the water. And so I just wanted to take this opportunity to invite and introduce Kara Woldrick, who is the current executive director for Portland Trails, and she'd like to say some things to you, Nathan, and about the trail right now.
Great, thanks, Jess. I'm Kara Woldrick, the executive director of Portland Trails, and I'm really honored to be part of this community, and that this community means all the people that showed up today, but also the Portland Trails membership and supporters and all the people that are using the trails. Nathan, thank you very much for all of your work, which is way beyond just the Eastern Prom Trail. I know that may have been one of your primary passion projects, but certainly not your only, the only massive change you made. And just to give you and everybody a sense of what this has meant is, if you look at Visit Maine promo materials about visiting Portland, Maine, you're surely going to see a picture of either the Eastern Prom Trail or from the Eastern Prom Trail. That's how our city is sold now. The Eastern Prom Trail will probably see north of 400,000 uses this year alone. That is an increase over other years. Usually we're around 340,000 uses a year, a little bit more during COVID. But what we're seeing, because we have some counters on the trails, we're able to see these uses, is that more and more people are using the trail pre-COVID at commuting time. And so we know that this is an active transportation corridor that's really important to the north, particularly, but also to Back Cove and off the peninsula. And with these businesses like Wex moving in right next to the trail, there's a reason that they built their world headquarters right on the Eastern Prom Trail, because it's beautiful. It is an incredible front yard for Portland, and I know the city manager really does see that area as the front yard and is working to make that a more beautiful place. And the trail is a huge part of why that is the front yard. But also, there's certainly plenty of recreation going on there and events, and most people that visit Portland on a cruise ship end up on that trail. And so it's just, you've created and crafted the experience that people have when they live, work, or visit Portland. And that is an incredible impact to have on the millions of visitors and the people that live here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kara. And we just have a message from Peter Monroe. He would like to share, although he was the president of the board during a couple of the early years of your work on the Eastern Prom Trail, Nathan, I had not known of many of the moving parts that you explained tonight. Thank you. I walk on it at least an hour every week. Be well. That's from Peter.
Thank you, Peter.
So I think we have a little more time if anybody would like to share another question, or Nathan, if there's anything that you would like to say in closing, we can.
I'll tell you what, I'll tell you one more story, okay? Let's
Great.
do that. Rather than, I mentioned the issue about the Portland Water District. You know, the Portland Water District has a sewage treatment plant. And so we were negotiating an easement to go up over their plant land and to go back down to Tukey's Bridge and connect with the whole back cove and the rest of the city. And they were worried that the smell of the sewage treatment plant would trigger a public demand that the plant invest major capital funds to further fix the sewage smell. And it was pretty bad. On a hot day, hot, humid day, it stank pretty good. So anyway, we crafted some language that sort of theoretically got around that problem. And flash forward, 6 years, I'm on the city council, and the water district shows up with a request to get authority. I guess the council had to approve it for the issuance of a $6 million bond to fix the smell at the sewage treatment plant. So I'm thinking to myself, well, I guess the chickens are coming home to roost. And it turned out conveniently that the folks on Munjoy Hill were upset about the smell as well. So there was a collateral public interest. But I remember when my fellow colleague on the city council, Jim Cloutier, got up and he said, and we've got a world-class trail here. We got to fix this smell. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if the Portland Water District can count on my vote here. And I'll leave it at that. Okay. Needless to say, they did the $6 million worth of work on the treatment plant, which benefited both the trail experience and, very importantly, obviously, the nearby residents on Munjoy Hill. But there are a few other examples I won't talk about where things that happened during the trail formation process came back, and I had to deal with them later in ways that I never dreamed I would have to deal with. But that's a thought for another day.
Thanks, Nathan. I know this is sort of I'm going to take a moment recognizing that we're in this time of doing things in different ways and we're not all together. And I really want to thank you, Nathan, for telling that story. It's inspiring. It's really inspiring to hear a story that started from just sort of like this idea and became, this gem. And I appreciate you taking the time to get this ready for us to share. And it's been great working with you, Sarah, on this series, pulling this together to kick us off for the year. And again, thanks, Nathan, and I hope everyone takes care.
Thank you, Jess, and thanks to the library as well. Yeah.
Good night.
And Portland.